So the question, why should we plan for biodiversity and ecosystem services? Farms already are complex to manage. The question of what to plant, will it be profitable? How are the markets going to change? So why do we want to add something on top of this to the daily or annual maintenance of a farm? The one compelling argument is this idea of ecosystem services, where the management of the farm is going to dictate what benefits you get from the farm. And so everything from here, what should I plant this year? Should I cultivate? Should I plant windbreaks or include conservation buffers? Dictates biodiversity patterns, which dictates these ecosystem services. These ecosystem services can enhance productivity, they can enhance profitability, and they can ultimately make the farm and the larger landscape more sustainable. Another reason is that biodiversity is being lost at a global scale. The Millennium Ecosystem Assessment suggested that we are losing species at 1 to 2 orders of magnitude greater than the normal background extinction rate. And what we can connect this to is the idea of planetary boundaries, or the thresholds of change when ecosystem disruption negatively impacts human health and well-being. In this figure on the right, we can see different planetary boundaries, things we might track and change. Areas within the green suggest that we are within a safe operating space, where yes, we've disrupted the system, but human health and well-being can still be maintained. The 3 systems that have crossed the planetary boundaries are the nitrogen cycle, climate change, and then on the top right we see biodiversity loss, which has crossed that planetary boundary to the greatest extent. Those 3 changes, and in particular biodiversity loss, have been driven by agricultural change. This map summarizes lands used for rangeland and cropland at a global scale, while all the areas in brown are dedicated to the production of food and fiber. And to kind of help summarize that, you can think if we took all the lands dedicated to range, that's the total continent of Africa, and the total area dedicated to cropland would fit in the area of South America. At an estimate, it's about somewhere just under 40% of terrestrial ice-free surface is dedicated to farming and food production. So if we're going to work to address that biodiversity crisis, working with farmers to monitor how their farms contribute to conservation is essential. Focusing on organic, we can actually see that organic farms can provide food, but also protect biodiversity. One of my predecessors at the University of Nebraska, she worked on a project that compared bird abundance and diversity in organic and non-organic land. So we can see in the figures on the left, the white bars represent organic, the black bars represent non-organic, that there was 2 times as many individual birds and 2 times as many species in organic and non-organic farms. At the same time, within organic farms, and some of my research is focused on what specific practices, how can the land be managed within organic farms to increase diversity. And one of those that we see is that small fields with intermittent patches of non-crop habitat can increase the abundance of a number of different species, including species like the threatened Bell's vireo, or important insectivores like the eastern kingbird. These demonstrated benefits of organic farming to biodiversity are pretty consistent. This is a summary from 2005, looking at the number of studies that have compared organic to non-organic systems, and the number of studies that showed a positive increase. For more recent literature reviews have shown the same pattern, and many of the cases where there isn't a positive, it's a neutral. So working with farmers to understand how their farms can contribute to biodiversity and motivating biodiversity conservation on farms is essential given the global extent of agricultural lands. And we can also come back to ecosystem services. In that same assessment of the health of biodiversity from the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, they looked at the health of the different ecosystem services. Food production has continued to increase. However, our production of food has come at the cost of these other ecosystem services. So again, if we want to focus on a sustainable landscape, sustainable farms, continuing to increase food production is important, but at the same time, we need to find a way to balance food production with our other ecosystem services. We can look at the ecosystem service value of these different regulating and supporting services. And I think this kind of highlights some of the maybe missing components, or how we often don't realize how important something is. In this figure, it's the different regulating and supporting services and their relative economic benefits. I like to point out, we can look at here, pollination is in the maroon, but as compared to some of these other supporting and regulated services, despite all the press it gets, it's one of the less economically valuable services. That doesn't say it's not important, but I think what I want to highlight here is the relative importance of erosion prevention and how economically important that is. And when we think about farms, a well-managed farm can reduce erosion. However, a farm that is not as well managed, you can, whether because it's only planted one crop, we can see the corn here, or just loss slowly over time due to different changes in stream flow, rainfall patterns. Now, erosion can cause major damages to the farm, but also over time that impacts a larger watershed and ecosystem. And we can look at benefits, that solutions that target ecosystem services. In particular, here we can think of soil erosion. So we have this nice buffer strip here in the middle of the field, which is going to help mitigate the negative impacts of soil erosion. But it provides habitat for pollinators, can improve the matrix or the habitat quality of a larger farm for birds. And so we want to help farmers identify how these simple practices ultimately benefit their farm and benefit the larger watershed and ecosystem. So that's, I hope, relatively compelling. And there's really good evidence out there that if we can learn from natural ecosystems, like we can see here on the left, and find a way to balance the benefits, the ecosystem services that we see here from natural ecosystems with the benefit of crop production from intensive cropland, we can move towards farmland, agricultural landscapes with restored ecosystem services. And given the amount of data, and given the evidence, and given the research that's been done, on one level, this should be a relatively straightforward process. However, the reality is that it's not. Just knowing something, having this knowledge of change, is not all that it takes. Creating behavior change is a more complex system than that. And so we kind of move towards this suggestion that understanding that some action taken on the farm can improve the system, or that doing something causes harm, doesn't necessarily change the behavior. And so if those two aren't connected, what needs to be changed in the middle? And this is kind of where the Healthy Farm Index becomes a tool for larger change in an ecosystem or in a region, but really focused on the individual farmer rather than the landscape or the farm itself. And so what we see here is this, we can think of the awareness of consequences was what we see here at the top. And over here we see the environmental behavior. So this is a pro-environmental behavior. So having a longer crop rotation, or including buffers as part of your farm, or setting aside land for pollinator or bird conservation. Between this awareness of the consequences of what are the consequences of erosion, we have multiple other attributes of the system that we have to identify. There's the norms of the individual. What do they do on a daily basis? What do they talk about? There's the larger social norms of the community they're embedded within. There's attitudes about different aspects. and then ultimately the perceived ability, the perceived behavioral control. So, can I do something about this or not? If we can, so if we start thinking about how do we move from these statements that ecosystems are threatened, species are being lost, ecosystem services are being disrupted, to adopting these pro-environmental behaviors, we can't just say this is how it should be. We need to identify and work within these kind of intermediate steps. And so one way to do that is to plan and monitor more deliberately. Where, can we change the intentions? Can we change the social norms? Can we disrupt attitudes that currently exist by having value-driven objectives that are agreed upon by a group or through collaborative discussions, targets that and monitoring that allow farmers to change the perceived behavioral control, and then ultimately maybe can we create